Chapter 1. The Invitation to Destiny. Tony Middleton adjusted his scarf as he jogged across the snow-dusted quad of Bramley College, his breath fogging the crisp December air. Winter had firmly settled over the picturesque campus, and the stone spires of the old buildings glistened with frost. The semester had ended, and most students were preparing to leave for the holidays, their laughter echoing through the courtyard. But Tony's mind was far from home or family gatherings. He was headed to meet his best friend, Sally Cartwright, in their favorite corner of the college library, a place where their shared passion for mystery solving had taken root. He found Sally tucked behind a towering stack of books, her auburn hair illuminated by the golden glow of a nearby lamp. She looked up from her notebook, where she had been scribbling theories about their last unsolved campus mystery, the case of the missing rare botanical specimen from the biology department. "Tony, you're late," she said, pretending to scold him. "I've had to solve this one all by myself." Tony grinned, plopping down in the chair opposite her. "I'll leave the boring plant thefts to you. I've got something much more exciting." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with gold filigree. Sally raised an eyebrow, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "What's this?" she asked, taking the envelope and examining the elegant handwriting on the front. "Miss Sally Cartwright and Mr. Tony Middleton." "Open it," Tony urged. Sally carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. As her eyes scanned the contents, her expression shifted from intrigue to astonishment. "You are cordially invited to the Marston family New Year's Eve ball at the Marston Manor," she read aloud. "A night of celebration, music, and fine dining to ring in the new year. Formal attire required." She looked up at Tony, her green eyes sparkling. "How on earth did you get this?" "Julian Marston," Tony replied, lounging back in his chair as though he had orchestrated the whole thing himself. "You know, the rich fellow in our literature class? He's invited a select few of us to his family's big event. Apparently it's the social highlight of the year. Champagne, fireworks, and the works." Sally frowned slightly. "Julian Marston? Isn't he the one who always brags about his family's wealth?" "The very same," Tony admitted with a chuckle. "But his invitation is genuine. He said he thought we'd liven up the crowd. His words, not mine." Sally hesitated. She wasn't entirely sure about spending New Year's Eve at a stranger's mansion, no matter how grand. But the idea of exploring a centuries-old estate and mingling with high society was undeniably tempting. "Well," she said, folding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope, "I suppose it would be rude to refuse such a gracious offer. Besides, it's not every day we get to attend a grand ball." Tony grinned. "That's the spirit, and who knows, maybe we'll stumble upon a mystery or two." The days leading up to New Year's Eve passed in a flurry of preparations. Sally borrowed a gown from her older sister, a shimmering emerald creation that brought out the color of her eyes, while Tony managed to procure a tailcoat and polished shoes that made him look quite the dashing gentleman, though he insisted on complaining about the stiffness of the collar. Finally, it was the 31st of December. Tony and Sally were headed to the Marston Manor, their excitement building with every mile. The countryside was a winter wonderland, the fields blanketed in snow, and the bare trees sparkling with frost. When they reached the manor, they were greeted by a scene straight out of a fairy tale. The sprawling estate was illuminated by hundreds of lanterns, their light dancing on the fresh snow. The manor itself was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, with towering spires, arched windows, and ivy crawling up its stone facade. It loomed against the darkening sky, majestic yet imposing. A liveried butler escorted them inside, where the warmth of the grand foyer enveloped them. The room was dominated by a sweeping staircase adorned with garlands of holly and gold ribbon. The scent of pine and beeswax polish filled the air, mingling with the faint strains of a string quartet playing in the ballroom beyond. "Welcome to Marston Manor," the butler intoned, his expression impassive. "Mr. Marston is expecting you." Tony and Sally exchanged a glance as they handed over their coats and stepped into the glittering world of the ball. Guests in sumptuous gowns and tailored suits mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their laughter and chatter filling the air. But as Sally took in the splendor, she couldn't shake a strange feeling, a sense of anticipation, as though the evening held more than just music and dancing. "I don't know about you," Tony said, leaning close to her, "but I feel like we've just stepped into one of our mystery novels." Sally nodded, her gaze sweeping over the room. Let's hope the night doesn't end with a chapter we're not prepared for. Neither of them could have guessed just how prophetic those words would be. Chapter 2. A Night of Glamour and Shadows. Tony Middleton adjusted the lapels of his tailcoat as he and Sally Cartwright stepped into the grand ballroom of the Marston Manor. If the entrance hall had been impressive, the ballroom was nothing short of breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the gilded ceiling, their light reflecting off polished floors and the glittering jewels of the guests. A string quartet played in one corner, their music weaving seamlessly into the hum of polite conversation. The room was a sea of elegance, with women in dazzling gowns and men in sharp evening attire. Sally paused for a moment, her eyes wide as she took in the grandeur. "It's like something out of a dream," she murmured, adjusting her emerald green gown. She felt both out of place and exhilarated, like a character stepping into the pages of a novel. Tony, ever the confident one, gave her a reassuring grin. "A dream, perhaps, but one where we belong. Look at us, blending right in with the upper crust." He winked, earning a playful elbow to the ribs from Sally. Before they could delve deeper into their surroundings, their host appeared. Julian Marston, resplendent in a tailored black suit with a deep red cravat, swept toward them with the practiced ease of someone used to commanding attention. His golden hair was perfectly coiffed, and his smile held the polished charm of the wealthy. "Tony, Sally," Julian greeted them warmly, extending his hands. "I'm so glad you could make it. The evening wouldn't be complete without my two favorite scholars." "Favorite scholars?" Sally repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You hardly know us, Julian." Julian chuckled, unperturbed. "Ah, but I know enough. Your reputation for curiosity and cleverness precedes you, and besides, I thought you'd appreciate the opportunity to mingle with society's finest." He gestured grandly to the assembled crowd. "Well, it's certainly an unforgettable scene," Tony said, his tone light, "though I can't help but feel there's more to this gathering than meets the eye." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, so brief that Sally almost missed it. "You might say that," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "Marston Manor has a way of stirring the past. But tonight we're here to celebrate, not dwell on old ghosts." Sally exchanged a glance with Tony. There was something in Julian's tone, a hint of unease beneath the charm, that intrigued her, but before she could ask him any more questions, he clapped his hands together. "Come, let me introduce you to some of the guests," Julian said, his usual confidence returning. "You must meet Aunt Clarissa. She's the true jewel of the Marston family, and the reason this manor is still standing." Lady Clarissa Marston was every bit as formidable as her reputation suggested. Draped in a deep burgundy gown that matched the rubies at her neck, she exuded an air of authority that silenced even the boldest of guests. Her sharp blue eyes appraised Tony and Sally as Julian introduced them. "Ah, the students," she said, her voice rich with aristocratic intonation. "Julian has mentioned you. I trust you're enjoying the festivities?" "We are," Sally replied, meeting Lady Clarissa's gaze with quiet confidence. "Your home is extraordinary, Lady Marston. It must have a fascinating history." "It does indeed," Lady Clarissa said, a faint smile playing at her lips. But history has its shadows, Miss Cartwright, and not all stories are meant to be shared. Her tone was light, but there was an edge to her words that left Sally unsettled. Before she could respond, a commotion near the ballroom doors drew their attention. A servant in a crisp uniform was struggling with a large gilded frame, which he carefully set against the wall. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the object of their attention was revealed. A portrait of a young woman with striking features, her dark eyes staring out with an almost lifelike intensity. "Ah, the famous portrait of Eleanor Marston," Julian said, his tone tinged with pride. "My great-great-grandmother. It's been locked away for decades, but Aunt Clarissa insisted it be brought out for tonight's celebration." "Why now?" Tony asked, his tone laced with curiosity. "Is there something special about this portrait?" Lady Clarissa's gaze lingered on the painting, her expression unreadable. Eleanor was a controversial figure in her time. Some say she brought both greatness and ruin to our family. But tonight is a time for celebration, not old grievances. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, their interest piqued further. It was becoming clear that the Marston family harbored more than their share of secrets. As the evening wore on, Tony and Sally mingled with the guests, picking up snippets of gossip and observing the dynamics of the crowd. Julian's charm made him the center of attention, but it was Lady Clarissa who held the true power in the room. Several guests whispered about her wealth, her shrewd business dealings, and the iron will that had kept the Marston legacy intact. Sally noticed a woman standing apart from the crowd, her dark gown and understated jewelry setting her apart from the glittering throng. She had a sharp, intelligent face and an air of quiet authority. Curious, Sally approached her. "Quite the gathering," Sally said by way of introduction. The woman turned to her with a faint smile. "It is, though I must admit I find such events rather tiresome. I prefer quieter pursuits." "I can understand that," Sally replied. "I'm Sally Cartwright, by the way." "Vivian Royce," the woman said, inclining her head. "A family friend, or at least that's what they call me. I suppose you're one of Julian's college friends?" Sally nodded. "Yes. He invited us to the ball. It's all quite grand." Vivian's smile turned wry. "Grand, yes. But every family has its cracks, no matter how polished the surface. The Marstons are no exception." Sally's ears perked up with interest. "Cracks? What do you mean?" Vivian hesitated, then shook her head. "I've said too much already, but if you're as observant as you seem, Miss Cartwright, you'll find the answers soon enough." Before Sally could press her further, the sound of a bell chiming drew everyone's attention. Lady Clarissa had ascended a small stage at the end of the ballroom, a glass of champagne in her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "at midnight we shall unveil a treasure from the Marston family vault, a symbol of our enduring legacy. Until then, enjoy the evening." As applause rippled through the room, Sally turned to Tony, who had rejoined her. "What do you think this treasure is?" she asked. Tony shrugged, but his eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Whatever it is, I doubt it's just another pretty bauble. There's more to this family than meets the eye." Sally nodded. The night was beautiful, yes, but beneath the glittering surface, shadows were gathering, and midnight was still hours away. Chapter 3. The Stroke of Death. The clock struck 12. A hush fell over the ballroom as the final chime of the grandfather clock echoed off the gilded walls. All eyes were fixed on the stage, where Lady Clarissa Marston stood beside a velvet-draped pedestal. Her presence was commanding, her posture as regal as any monarch. In her hand was a delicate glass of champagne, its golden hue catching the light of the chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly over the expectant crowd, "tonight we mark the beginning of a new year. but we also celebrate the Marston family's enduring legacy, a legacy of strength, resilience, and, above all, excellence. To honor this, I will unveil a treasure that has not been seen by eyes outside our family for nearly a century. The crowd murmured in anticipation, a ripple of excitement sweeping through the room. Tony and Sally stood near the back, their attention fixed on the scene unfolding before them. "What do you think it is?" Sally whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs. "Probably some priceless heirloom," Tony replied, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Or maybe something more controversial. Families like the Marstons tend to hoard secrets alongside their treasures." Lady Clarissa raised her glass in a toast. "To the future," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "and to the past that has shaped us." The guests echoed her toast, lifting their glasses high. Then, with a flourish, she reached for the velvet covering. She pulled it away, revealing— A gasp swept through the room. On the pedestal rested an ornate golden casket, encrusted with jewels that glittered like fire in the candlelight. Its surface was intricately engraved with swirling patterns and Latin inscriptions. Lady Clarissa allowed the moment to hang, basking in the awe of her audience. "This," she said, her voice thick with pride, "is the Marston Reliquary, crafted in the late 1600s and believed to hold relics of untold value. It is a symbol of our family's lineage and our place in history." Applause broke out, polite but enthusiastic. Yet Sally couldn't shake the unease growing in her chest. There was something too perfect, too calculated about the presentation. She turned to Tony, who was studying the reliquary with a look of keen interest. Before either could speak, the applause was interrupted by a sharp, strangled gasp. Heads turned as Lady Clarissa staggered, her glass of champagne slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. She clutched her chest, her expression one of shock and agony. For a moment, the room was frozen in stunned silence. Then she crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, some rushing forward while others stood rooted in place, too stunned to move. Julian Marston leaped onto the stage, kneeling beside his aunt and calling her name in desperation. But Lady Clarissa lay motionless, her eyes staring blankly at the gilded ceiling. "She's dead!" a voice cried, sending a ripple of panic through the crowd. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, their instincts kicking in. While others floundered in shock, the two friends pushed their way to the front of the room, their curiosity overriding any hesitation. Julian looked up as they approached, his face pale and stricken. "She just collapsed," he said, his voice trembling. "She was fine a moment ago. She was fine." Sally knelt beside the body. Lady Clarissa's skin had taken on a faintly bluish tint. Her hand still clutched the velvet cloth she had used to unveil the reliquary, but the shattered glass of champagne on the floor caught Sally's attention. "She drank from the glass just before she collapsed," Sally murmured. "Tony, do you think—" "Poison?" Tony finished, crouching beside her. He scanned the scene, his sharp eyes taking in the details. "It's possible. And if that's the case, it means someone planned this. Deliberately." Before they could speculate further, a booming voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone remain calm." The speaker was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark coat, his presence commanding. It was Inspector Hargrave, the local police inspector, who had been invited as a guest of the Marstons. He stepped onto the stage, his stern gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Clear the room immediately," he ordered. "No one is to leave the manor until I've conducted a full investigation. This is now a matter for the law." The guests hesitated, some protesting, but the inspector's authority was absolute. Slowly, the room emptied, leaving only Julian, a few close family members, and Tony and Sally, who lingered at the edge of the scene. Within the hour, the ballroom had been transformed into a crime scene. Lady Clarissa's body had been carefully examined and removed, and Inspector Hargrave was questioning those who had been nearest to her at the time of her collapse. Tony and Sally hovered nearby, their minds racing with possibilities. "Inspector," Tony said, stepping forward, "if it helps, we noticed that Lady Clarissa's champagne glass seemed to play a role in her collapse." Hargrave turned to him, his expression unreadable. "And who might you be?" "Tony Middleton," he said, gesturing to Sally. "And this is Sally Cartwright. We're friends of Julian Marston. We've taken an interest in mysteries before." "Amateurs," Hargrave muttered, though not unkindly. "Well, Mr. Middleton, Miss Cartwright, you'd best leave the investigation to the professionals." Sally bristled, but held her tongue. Tony, however, pressed on. "We're not trying to interfere, Inspector. We only want to help. Sometimes a fresh perspective can uncover something unexpected." Hargrave regarded him for a moment, then nodded gruffly. "Fine. But stay out of my way." With that small victory, Tony and Sally set about examining the scene more closely. Sally's eyes lingered on the reliquary, which had been untouched since the unveiling. "Do you think it has anything to do with the death?" she asked. "Possibly," Tony said, his gaze shifting to the champagne glass shards. "But the poison, if that's what it was, seems more personal. Someone wanted Lady Clarissa dead, and they wanted to ensure it happened tonight." As they worked, a shadow fell over them. It was Julian, his face pale but resolute. "I don't care what Inspector Hargrave says," he said quietly. "If you two can help figure out who did this, I want you to try. My aunt didn't deserve to die like this." Tony nodded, his jaw set. "We'll do everything we can." As the clock ticked into the early hours of the new year, Tony and Sally knew one thing for certain. The mystery of Lady Clarissa's death was only beginning. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Shadows.
The air in Marston Manor was thick with unease, the gaiety of the evening shattered by Lady Clarissa's sudden death. Guests had retreated to their chambers or gathered in small, hushed groups in the sitting rooms, each whispering their own theories and fears. The once vibrant atmosphere of celebration had turned dark, as if the manor itself mourned its matriarch. Tony and Sally, however, were anything but idle. After Julian had retreated to compose himself, they quietly slipped away to start their own investigation. "I don't like being told to stay out of the way," Sally muttered, her footsteps muffled on the carpet. "If the inspector thinks we're just going to sit back and do nothing, he doesn't know us at all. Let's start with the staff. They see everything, even if they don't say much," said Tony. They reached the kitchen, where a few servants had gathered, speaking in hushed voices. At their approach, the conversation stopped, and the servants looked up, startled. A middle-aged housekeeper with a severe expression stepped forward, her apron slightly askew. "Can we help you?" she asked, her tone guarded. "We're friends of Julian Marston," Sally said gently. "We're just trying to understand what happened tonight. Lady Clarissa's death." "Was an accident," the housekeeper interrupted sharply. "It's tragic, yes, but accidents happen. There's no need to stir up trouble." Tony leaned against the doorframe, his casual posture belying his sharp gaze. "An accident? Lady Clarissa didn't seem the sort to keel over without reason. You must have seen something." The housekeeper's lips tightened. "It's not my place to speculate, and it's certainly not yours either." Sally stepped in, her voice calm but firm. "We're not here to accuse anyone, but if there's something unusual you've noticed, something out of the ordinary, it might help us make sense of what happened." For a moment, the woman hesitated. Then, with a glance at the other servants, she sighed. "There's been tension in the house more than usual. Lady Clarissa had an argument with Mr. Julian a few days ago. It wasn't loud, but we could hear the tone of it through the walls. He stormed out after she told him something about cutting him off financially. Sally exchanged a glance with Tony. That was a detail worth remembering. "What about tonight?" Tony asked. "Did you notice anyone behaving strangely?" The housekeeper hesitated again, then nodded reluctantly. "Miss Royce, Vivian Royce, wasn't herself. She seemed distracted, almost jumpy, and she barely touched her food. But then she's always been an odd one." "Odd how?" Sally pressed. "She's been visiting the manor for years, but she never quite fits in," the housekeeper said. "She's close to Lady Clarissa. Was close, I suppose. But there's always been something guarded about her, like she's hiding something." Tony filed the information away, the wheels in his mind churning. "And the reliquary," he said, his tone shifting. "Do you know why Lady Clarissa chose tonight to reveal it?" The housekeeper shook her head. "No one knew she was planning to. It was a surprise to all of us." Before Tony or Sally could ask more, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. The housekeeper stiffened, and the other servants scattered. Inspector Hargrave appeared at the doorway, his expression grim. "What are you two doing here?" he demanded. "Following up on a lead," Tony said smoothly. "Stay out of it," Hargrave growled. "This isn't a game. You're meddling where you don't belong." "Then give us something to do," Sally countered, her voice sharper than usual. "Lady Clarissa was murdered. We both know that. If you let us help, we might uncover something you miss." Hargrave's glare softened slightly, and he seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he sighed. "Fine. If you're so determined, talk to the guests. But leave the physical evidence to me. Understood?" "Understood," Tony said, though Sally doubted they'd entirely adhere to that condition. Later, Tony and Sally found themselves in one of the manor's smaller drawing rooms, poring over the details they'd learned. A fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to ease the chill of the night. "So," Sally began, ticking off points on her fingers, "we have Julian, who had a recent argument with Lady Clarissa about money. Then there's Vivian, who seems to have been acting strangely all evening. And let's not forget the reliquary, which apparently came out of nowhere." Tony nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's too soon to draw conclusions, but it's obvious that Lady Clarissa's death wasn't random. Everything tonight feels deliberate. The timing, the reliquary, even the way she collapsed in front of everyone." "Whoever did this wanted to make a statement," Sally said. "But why? And why poison?" Tony leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. "Poison is a coward's weapon. It's precise, calculated, and it leaves little evidence if done right. Whoever killed her didn't just want her dead. They wanted to avoid suspicion." Sally frowned. "Then why do it in such a public way? Poison can be subtle, but collapsing in front of an audience is the opposite of subtle." Tony tilted his head, considering her point. "Maybe they wanted to frame someone. Or maybe it was about sending a message. Either way, we're missing something. A motive or a connection between all of this." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of muffled sobs from the hallway. Sally rose and peeked out, finding Julian sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. His usually confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. "Julian?" Sally said gently. "Are you all right?" He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "No, I'm not. She was the only real family I had left, and now she's gone. And the way she died—" He trailed off, his voice breaking. Sally sat beside him, her tone soft but probing. "Julian, we want to help, but we need to know everything. Did your argument with Lady Clarissa have anything to do with what happened tonight?" Julian's face twisted in anguish. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're asking. Yes, we argued. She said she was tired of bailing me out of trouble, but I didn't hate her. He stopped, clenching his fists. I loved her, even if she didn't always approve of me. Sally placed a hand on his arm. We believe you, Julian. But the more we know, the better chance we have of finding the truth. Julian hesitated, then nodded. There's something you should know. The reliquary. She never told anyone why she kept it hidden for so long. But there was always a rumor in the family. Something about a curse. Tony, who had joined them by now, raised an eyebrow. A curse? Julian shrugged helplessly. I don't know if it's true, but Aunt Clarissa always said that some things were better left untouched. Maybe she was right. As the firelight flickered in the room, Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. The reliquary might hold more than just historical significance. It might be the key to understanding everything. Chapter 5. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The morning after Lady Clarissa's tragic death dawned gray and somber. The storm that had raged the previous night, leaving the grounds of Marston Manor blanketed in fresh snow. The once grand estate, usually a hive of activity, now seemed cloaked in silence. Tony and Sally sat in the breakfast room, a cavernous space with high windows overlooking the frosty gardens. Plates of untouched food sat before them, the rich aromas of freshly baked bread and coffee unable to dispel the heavy atmosphere. The remaining guests were subdued, their laughter and light conversation from the night before replaced by whispers and darting glances. Inspector Hargrave had made it clear that no one would leave the manor until his investigation was complete. For now, the guests were effectively prisoners of circumstance, their every movement scrutinized by the stern inspector and his men. Tony broke the silence. We need to figure out what's so important about that reliquary. He leaned forward, his voice low. Julian mentioned a curse, but there has to be more to it than that. Something about that casket made Lady Clarissa decide to unveil it last night. Sally nodded, her gaze drifting to the snow-covered garden outside. And someone wanted to make sure she didn't live to enjoy its unveiling. Poisoning her in front of everyone, it's calculated. They wanted a spectacle. Tony tilted his head thoughtfully. Or a distraction. What if the murder wasn't the end game? What if it was just the first move? Before Sally could respond, the butler entered the room. He cleared his throat delicately. Inspector Hargrave wishes to see you both in the library. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, then rose and followed the butler down the grand hallway, their footsteps muffled on the thick Persian rugs. The library, with its dark oak paneling and towering shelves of leather-bound books, was a stark contrast to the cold, gray morning outside. Inspector Hargrave stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed. His sharp eyes flicked to them as they entered. I've reconsidered your involvement, he said brusquely. You seem to have a knack for finding out what others won't tell me. I won't stop you from investigating, but you'll report directly to me. Understood? Understood, Tony said quickly, a note of satisfaction in his voice. Hargrave nodded and gestured to a small table by the window. On it lay the reliquary, its gold and jeweled surface gleaming even in the subdued light. Two constables stood guard nearby, their expressions impassive. This is the item Lady Clarissa unveiled before her death, Hargrave said. I've examined it thoroughly. No traps, no hidden mechanisms. But there is something strange about it. He stepped closer and opened the reliquary, revealing a velvet-lined interior with several small compartments. Most were empty, but one contained a folded piece of aged parchment. The parchment was delicate, its edges frayed with age. Written in an elegant hand was a single line in Latin, Quod servatur servet tibi. What does it mean? Hargrave mused aloud. Sally, who had taken several years of Latin, translated it. What is kept, keeps you. Tony frowned. Cryptic, but ominous. Do you think it's a warning? Hargrave shrugged. Possibly, but without context, it's just another mystery. That's where you come in. I want you to dig deeper into the reliquary, the Marston family history, and anything else you can find. After leaving the library, Tony and Sally decided to start with the Marston family's history. They made their way to the family archives, located in a dimly lit room on the manor's third floor. The space was filled with musty tomes, old ledgers, and boxes of brittle papers, the air thick with the scent of aged parchment. Sally took charge, her organizational skills kicking in as she sorted through the clutter. Tony, less disciplined but equally curious, began leafing through an old ledger. "Look at this," Sally said, holding up a yellowed photograph. It depicted a group of people standing in front of the manor, likely from the late 1700s, judging by their clothing. At the center was a striking woman with dark eyes and an enigmatic smile. That must be Eleanor Marston, the woman in the portrait. Tony leaned in for a closer look. "She's captivating, isn't she? But there's something unsettling about her." They dug further, piecing together fragments of Eleanor's story. Born into the Marston family at the height of its wealth, Eleanor had been a prominent figure in society, known for her charm and intellect. But she was also shrouded in scandal. Rumors of forbidden romances, financial improprieties, and even accusations of dabbling in the occult followed her throughout her life. "Here's something," Tony said, pulling out an old journal. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were filled with tight, slanted handwriting. "It's Eleanor's diary." The entries were a mix of mundane observations and cryptic musings. One passage stood out. "The reliquary holds more than relics. It holds the weight of our sins. To reveal its contents is to invite ruin." Sally mused. If Eleanor believed the reliquary was dangerous, why did Lady Clarissa keep it? And why reveal it now? Tony shook his head. Maybe she thought it was just superstition, or maybe she didn't have a choice. As they returned to the main part of the house, Tony and Sally couldn't shake the feeling that the reliquary was the key to everything. But their search had raised more questions than answers. When they reached the drawing room, they found Julian waiting for them. He looked haggard, his usually bright demeanor dulled by grief. "I heard you've been poking around the archives," he said. "Find anything useful?" "Plenty," Sally replied. "But we need to know more about your aunt. Why did she decide to reveal the reliquary last night? Did she ever talk about it with you?" Julian hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Not directly, but I know she was under pressure. Someone had been sending her letters, threatening letters. She didn't tell me who they were from, but I think it had something to do with the reliquary." Sally's pulse quickened. "Do you still have the letters?" Julian shook his head. "No, she burned them. Said she didn't want them to haunt her." Tony leaned forward. "And Vivian Royce? What's her connection to all of this?" Julian sighed. "Vivian was one of my aunt's closest friends. They had a complicated relationship. Sometimes they'd argue for hours, and other times they were inseparable. But Vivian always seemed secretive, like she knew something the rest of us didn't." Sally nodded slowly. The reliquary, the letters, the strange dynamics between Lady Clarissa and her inner circle, everything pointed to a web of secrets that had finally unraveled in murder. As the snow continued to fall outside, Tony and Sally knew their work was far from over. Somewhere within the manor, the truth was waiting to be uncovered.
Chapter 6. Shadows of Suspicion. Inspector Hargrave assembled the guests in the grand drawing room. The atmosphere was tense, the whispers of hushed conversations echoing off the ornate walls. Tony and Sally sat off to one side, their sharp eyes scanning the room as Hargrave prepared to begin his formal questioning. "This is not a social gathering," Hargrave began, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "Lady Clarissa's death was no accident, and your cooperation is not a request. It is a requirement." He gestured to the butler, who stepped forward with a clipboard. "We will speak with each of you individually. Mr. Middleton and Miss Cartwright have been permitted to assist under my supervision." Hargrave shot them a pointed glance, clearly still skeptical of their involvement. "Let's begin. Suspect 1, Julian Marston." The first to be questioned was Julian Marston. He sat stiffly in one of the high-backed chairs, his normally confident demeanor replaced with unease. His eyes darted between Hargrave and Tony, as though searching for an ally. "Mr. Marston," Hargrave began, pacing slowly in front of him, "you were the host of last night's gathering. That makes you uniquely positioned to know about Lady Clarissa's plans. Did you know she intended to unveil the reliquary?" Julian hesitated. "No, Inspector. She didn't tell me, or anyone else as far as I know. It was a complete surprise." Sally interjected gently. "But you argued with her recently, didn't you? About money?" Julian's face flushed. "Yes, we argued. She was angry because I had some debts, and she didn't want to bail me out again. But that doesn't mean I'd kill her. She was my aunt, for heaven's sake." Hargrave's expression didn't soften. "You were in a difficult financial situation. Her death clears the way for you to inherit her estate, does it not?" Julian's hands clenched into fists. "I won't deny I've made mistakes, but I loved my aunt. She was the only family I had left. I'd never hurt her." Tony leaned forward. "Julian, you mentioned threatening letters she received. Did you ever suspect who might have sent them?" Julian shook his head. "No. She wouldn't tell me. She said it wasn't my concern." As Hargrave dismissed him, Julian's frustration was evident, but Tony and Sally couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered on the reliquary as he left the room. Suspect 2, Vivian Royce. Next was Vivian Royce. She sat with the poise of someone used to scrutiny, her dark eyes calm but watchful. Draped in a simple black gown, she seemed almost out of place among the manor's opulence. "Miss Royce," Hargrave began, his tone neutral, "you've been a close friend of Lady Clarissa for years. Can you tell us about your relationship?" Vivian tilted her head slightly, as though weighing her words. "Clarissa and I were close, yes. We shared many confidences. She trusted me, and I trusted her." "And yet," Hargrave continued, "the staff observed tension between the two of you, arguments even." Vivian's calm exterior didn't waver. "Clarissa was a strong-willed woman, and so am I. We didn't always see eye to eye, but our disagreements were never serious." Sally leaned forward, her voice soft but probing. "Did Lady Clarissa ever confide in you about the reliquary, or about the threatening letters she received?" Vivian hesitated for the first time. She mentioned the letters, but only briefly. She didn't want to involve me. As for the reliquary, she was conflicted about it. She believed it represented both her family's pride and its curse. "A curse?" Hargrave echoed, raising an eyebrow. Vivian's lips tightened. Clarissa was not a superstitious woman, but she carried the weight of her family's history. The reliquary was a symbol of that history, both its glory and its shame. Tony's sharp eyes caught a flicker of something in her expression. Guilt, perhaps? "Where were you during the unveiling?" "In the back of the room," Vivian replied smoothly. "I wasn't close enough to see anything unusual." Her composure was impeccable, but as she left, Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. Vivian Royce was a woman with secrets, and they were determined to uncover them. Suspect 3. Lord Edwin Blackthorne. The final suspect was Lord Edwin Blackthorne, an elderly man with a haughty demeanor and a thin veneer of civility. He walked with a cane, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. "Lord Blackthorne," Hargrave began, "you've known the Marston family for decades. What can you tell us about your relationship with Lady Clarissa?" Blackthorne snorted. "Clarissa and I were acquaintances, nothing more. I attended her gatherings out of courtesy, not affection." "And yet you were a guest of honor last night," Hargrave pressed. "That suggests a closer connection." Blackthorn's eyes flashed. If you're suggesting I had any love for that woman, you're mistaken. Clarissa was shrewd, manipulative, and utterly insufferable. But I'm no murderer. Tony spoke up. You've been outspoken about your disdain for the Marston family. Why? Blackthorn's lips curled into a sneer. Because they've built their fortune on lies. The reliquary, for instance. Nothing but a bauble they've inflated into legend. Clarissa's obsession with it was a farce. Sally leaned in, her tone calm but pointed. If you thought so little of the reliquary, why did you attend the unveiling? Blackthorn hesitated, his hand tightening on his cane. Curiosity, nothing more. And now, I regret wasting my time. Hargrave's eyes narrowed. Where were you during the unveiling? By the fireplace, Blackthorn replied. I stayed away from the crowd. I had no interest in the theatrics. As Blackthorn left the room, his cane tapping sharply on the floor, Tony whispered to Sally, He's bitter enough to kill, but is that enough of a motive? After the interrogations, once the suspects had been questioned, Tony and Sally gathered in the small study where they could speak freely. Julian has motive, Sally began, ticking off her points. The inheritance, the argument about money, it all adds up, but he seems genuinely grief-stricken. If he's acting, he's doing a good job. Vivian is harder to read, Tony added. She clearly knows more than she's letting on, and her connection to Lady Clarissa feels complicated. Trust mixed with resentment, maybe? And then there's Blackthorn, Sally said. His bitterness toward the Marstons is obvious, but he almost seems too disdainful to bother with murder. Tony leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. The reliquary is at the center of all this. Whether it's superstition, greed, or revenge, it's tied to the murder. We just need to figure out how.
Chapter 7. A Twisted Revelation. The tension within the Marston manor seemed to reach a breaking point as dusk settled over the snow-covered estate. The muted murmurs of the guests and staff, the distant crackle of a fireplace, and the faint sound of the wind outside created an uneasy symphony of suspense. Tony and Sally, sitting in the manor's dimly lit study, were deep in discussion about the suspect's motives when a frantic knock interrupted their conversation. Julian burst into the room, his face pale and his breathing uneven. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice trembling. "What happened?" Sally asked, already rising from her seat. "It's Vivian," Julian replied, his tone heavy with dread. "She's gone." Julian led them to the guest wing, where Vivian Royce's room lay in disarray. The bed was unmade, her luggage had been rifled through, and a single window was wide open, letting in a blast of icy air. Snow had gathered on the sill, but there were no footprints visible outside. "She wouldn't just leave," Julian insisted, pacing the room. "Not like this." Tony scanned the scene. She might not have left voluntarily. If someone wanted to silence her, they might have taken her. Sally frowned. But why? Unless she knew something. Something that made her a threat. As they examined the room further, Sally's sharp eyes caught a scrap of paper tucked under a fallen pillow. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a hastily scrawled note. "It's not safe. The truth is buried, but it won't stay hidden. Meet me where the shadows fall." "Cryptic, as always," Tony muttered. "What does that even mean?" Sally's gaze darkened. "It means she was trying to tell someone something important. But where?" Julian's expression shifted from confusion to realization. "The library," he said. "There's a hidden passage in the library. My aunt showed it to me once when I was a child. If Vivian wanted to hide or meet someone in secret, that's where she'd go." The secret passage. With Julian leading the way, Tony and Sally hurried to the library. The grand room, with its towering shelves and flickering fireplace, seemed even more imposing now. Julian guided them to a section of shelves in the far corner and pressed a specific book, a thick tome titled The Marston Chronicles. With a soft click, the shelf shifted, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Well, this certainly fits the bill for where shadows fall," Tony quipped, trying to lighten the oppressive mood. Sally ignored him, her attention focused on the steps ahead. "If she's down there, she might be in danger. Let's move." They descended cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the tight space. The air grew colder and damper as they reached the bottom, where the passage opened into a small stone chamber. A single lantern flickered on a hook, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And there, in the center of the room, was Vivian Royce, alive, but trembling. She was clutching a leather-bound journal to her chest, her dark eyes wide with fear. "Vivian!" Sally called out, rushing to her. "What are you doing down here? Are you all right?" Vivian looked up, her voice barely a whisper. "I found it. The truth. It's worse than I ever imagined." The truth revealed. Vivian handed the journal to Sally, who opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Lady Clarissa's handwriting, detailing events from her life that had never been spoken of aloud. As Sally read aloud, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Lady Clarissa had discovered the reliquary's true contents years ago. It held not just religious artifacts, but evidence of crimes committed by the Marston family, embezzlement, bribery, and even a murder covered up generations ago. The reliquary's unveiling had been a desperate act. Lady Clarissa had planned to expose the truth and cleanse her family's name, even if it meant destroying its legacy. The threatening letters had come from someone within the family, someone who wanted to keep the truth buried at all costs. Tony's eyes narrowed. So the reliquary wasn't just a symbol. It was leverage, and someone killed Lady Clarissa to keep her from revealing what it contained. Vivian nodded. "I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen. She thought she could control the fallout. She underestimated how far someone would go to stop her." Sally closed the journal, her mind racing. "Who sent the letters, Vivian? Do you know?" Vivian hesitated, then whispered, "Julian." A shocking turn. The air in the chamber grew electric as all eyes turned to Julian. His face twisted with a mix of anger and desperation. "That's a lie? I never sent those letters." "Then why did she think you did?" Vivian demanded, her voice rising. "Clarissa was terrified of you. She knew you were desperate, that you had the most to lose if the truth came out." Julian's fists clenched. "I had nothing to do with this. I would never hurt her." Tony stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Enough. This isn't solving anything. If Julian didn't send the letters, then who did?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the passage. Inspector Hargrave appeared, his expression grim. "I've heard enough." Hargrave's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in Vivian's trembling form, the journal in Sally's hands, and Julian's defiant stance. "Julian Marston, you're under arrest for the murder of Lady Clarissa Marston." "What?" Julian's voice was a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "You can't be serious." "The evidence is damning," Hargrave said coldly. "Your financial troubles, your argument with Lady Clarissa, and now this journal tying you to the letters. It's clear you had motive and opportunity." Tony stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Inspector, I don't think Julian did this." "And why is that, Mr. Middleton?" Hargrave asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "Because this feels too convenient," Tony replied. "The letters, the journal, even Vivian's accusations. It's all pointing to Julian because someone wants us to believe he's guilty." Sally nodded. "Think about it. If Julian were the killer, why would he stay? Why would he lead us to the secret passage or let us find Vivian? It doesn't add up. Hargrave hesitated, the weight of their argument sinking in. Then who? He demanded. Tony looked back at the reliquary in his mind, piecing everything together. Someone who's been hiding in plain sight. Someone who knew exactly how to frame Julian and keep the truth buried. A heavy silence fell over the room as the realization dawned on them all. The killer was still among them. Chapter 8. Threads of Deception. The atmosphere in the secret chamber was electric, the air heavy with suspicion and fear. Inspector Hargrave, standing with his arms crossed, studied each person carefully, his stern gaze flicking between Julian, Vivian, Tony, and Sally. The dim lantern light cast long shadows across the stone walls, giving the moment a sense of foreboding. Tony broke the silence. We need to think this through. If Julian isn't the killer, and if Vivian's right that someone wanted to keep the truth buried, we're dealing with someone cunning enough to manipulate us all. Sally nodded. It's someone who knows this house, its secrets, and the Marston family history. Someone who could create those letters, access the poison, and frame Julian. Vivian looked wary. You think it's one of the guests? Tony's eyes narrowed. It has to be. The question is who and why. Clues in the dark. The group returned to the library, bringing Vivian and the journal with them. Hargrave took charge, ordering the constables to keep watch on both Julian and Vivian, while Tony and Sally delved deeper into the journal's contents. As Sally flipped through the brittle pages, she paused at a particularly chilling entry written by Lady Clarissa months before her death. I've seen the shadows grow longer in this house. The reliquary holds more than relics. It holds a mirror to the Marston soul. I fear the day it is opened. The sins of the past will devour us all. This sounds less like a confession and more like a warning, Sally murmured. She wasn't just worried about the reliquary's contents. She was scared of someone in her own family. Tony frowned, pacing the length of the room. We're missing something. If Clarissa was afraid, why go through with the unveiling? She must have known the risk. Unless she thought the risk was worth it, Sally said, her voice thoughtful. Maybe she believed exposing the truth would stop whoever was threatening her. Hargrave, who had been listening silently, spoke up. The reliquary's contents, whatever evidence it holds, might be important, but it's not enough to explain murder. People kill for power, revenge, or money. We have to figure out which motive fits this case. While Sally continued to analyze the journal, Tony decided to investigate the guests more directly. He started with Lord Edwin Blackthorne, finding him brooding in the conservatory, nursing a glass of brandy. The older man seemed unbothered by the day's events, his sharp gaze betraying little emotion. Lord Blackthorne, Tony began, his tone neutral. You've made it clear you didn't think much of Lady Clarissa. But surely you must care about the Marston legacy. Why else would you attend the unveiling? Blackthorne sneered. The Marston legacy is a farce, boy. Clarissa was a fool to dredge up that cursed reliquary. Some things are better left buried. Tony leaned forward slightly. You seem to know a lot about what's buried. What aren't you telling us? Blackthorne's expression darkened. You're poking around where you don't belong. Be careful, Middleton. Some answers come with a price. Next, Tony found Vivian Royce in the drawing room, sitting quietly by the fire. She seemed more composed than before, though her eyes betrayed her lingering fear. Vivian, Tony said gently, sitting across from her. You knew Lady Clarissa better than anyone. Did she ever tell you why she wanted to reveal the reliquary now? Vivian hesitated, her fingers toying with the edge of her shawl. She said it was time for the truth to come out, that the family needed to face its demons. And you disagreed? Tony pressed. I told her it was dangerous, Vivian admitted, her voice shaking. I begged her to leave it alone, but she was determined. She said she couldn't live with the lies anymore. Tony studied her closely. What lies, Vivian? What was she trying to expose? Vivian looked away, her voice barely a whisper. Everything. The reliquary, the letters, the curse. She wanted to tear it all down. Meanwhile, Sally had uncovered something troubling in the journal. One entry, written shortly before Lady Clarissa's death, included a list of names. Beside each name was a single word: Julian, debt, Vivian, loyalty, Blackthorn, betrayal, Eleanor, legacy. Legacy? Sally murmured, her brow furrowing. Tony, this isn't just a list of names, it's a map of motives. Tony returned to the library as Sally explained her theory. Lady Clarissa knew these people's secrets. She knew their weaknesses, their sins. She must have been planning to expose them all. But Eleanor? Tony asked, pointing to the last name. She's been dead for years. Sally nodded. Exactly. Which means the legacy she left behind, the reliquary, the family's secrets, still holds power over the living. Their discussion was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. One of the constables burst into the room, his face pale. Inspector Hargrave, there's been another incident. The group hurried to the source of the disturbance, the gallery where Eleanor Marston's portrait hung. The painting had been slashed across the canvas, the once striking face of Eleanor now marred by jagged tears. This wasn't random, Hargrave muttered, his jaw tightening. The killer is sending a message. Tony studied the painting, his mind racing. Or erasing one. Eleanor's legacy. It's connected to the reliquary, isn't it? Someone doesn't want us to find the truth. Sally, her eyes scanning the room, noticed something glinting on the floor beneath the painting. She bent down and picked up a small silver locket, its clasp broken. Opening it, she found a tiny photograph inside. A younger Lady Clarissa standing with a man who bore a striking resemblance to Blackthorn. Tony, Sally said, her voice trembling. I think we just found our missing piece. Tony's eyes widened as he pieced it together. Blackthorn wasn't just a family friend. He's part of the Marston legacy. Hargrave's expression darkened. And if he's been hiding that, what else has he been hiding? As the pieces began to fall into place, the tension in the manor reached a fever pitch. The killer was growing desperate, their actions becoming bolder and more reckless. The slashed painting, the stolen reliquary, the poisoned glass, it all pointed to someone with both knowledge of the family's secrets and a deep, personal stake in the outcome.
Chapter 9. The Killer Revealed. The grand drawing room of the manor was quiet save for the crackle of the fire in the ornate hearth. Inspector Hargrave, Tony, Sally, Julian, Vivian, and Lord Blackthorn gathered there, each wearing an expression of wariness and tension. The slashed portrait of Eleanor Marston and the stolen reliquary had pushed the investigation into a boiling point. Tony and Sally stood near the fireplace, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. Sally clutched the silver locket they'd found beneath Eleanor's painting, her mind racing as she prepared to confront the truth. Inspector Hargrave stepped forward, his authoritative presence commanding attention. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of this mystery, but before we proceed, Mr. Middleton and Miss Cartwright have something to share. Tony nodded, stepping into the center of the room. This case has been about more than just Lady Clarissa's murder. It's about the secrets that have haunted this family for generations. The reliquary, the threatening letters, the portrait. Everything points to one undeniable truth. Someone in this room has been willing to kill to protect their legacy. He turned to Sally, who stepped forward, holding up the locket. This locket belonged to Eleanor Marston. Inside, there's a photograph of her with a man, someone who bears a striking resemblance to Lord Blackthorn. Blackthorn's expression darkened, but he said nothing. "This isn't just a resemblance," Sally continued. "It's proof. Lord Blackthorn isn't just a family friend. He's a Marston." Blackthorn scoffed, his cane tapping sharply on the floor. "That's absurd. Eleanor and I were friends, nothing more." "Friends don't leave behind heirlooms like this," Sally countered, "and friends don't get listed in Lady Clarissa's journal alongside words like betrayal." Julian's face twisted in confusion. "Are you saying Blackthorn is… what? My great-uncle?" Tony nodded. "Exactly. Eleanor and Blackthorn had a child out of wedlock, a scandal that would have ruined the Marston name at the time. The family covered it up, cutting Blackthorn out of the inheritance and erasing his connection to the legacy." Vivian, who had been silent until now, spoke softly. "That's why you hate the Marstons so much. They denied you what was rightfully yours." Blackthorn's eyes blazed with fury. "Rightfully mine? I was cast aside like garbage. They called me a stain on their precious name, while Eleanor was locked away in shame. And then Clarissa, always so self-righteous, had the gall to flaunt her power, holding that cursed reliquary as if it absolved her of our family's sins." Tony's voice cut through Blackthorn's anger. "And that's why you killed her, because you couldn't bear for the truth to come out, not on her terms." The murder explained. Hargrave stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Let's hear it, Blackthorn. Did you send the threatening letters?" Blackthorn straightened, his haughty demeanor returning. "Yes, I sent the letters. But they weren't threats, they were warnings. I told her not to unveil the reliquary. I told her it would destroy us all." "And when she refused to listen," Sally said, her voice steady, "you decided to stop her permanently." Blackthorn's gaze turned cold. Clarissa was going to expose the family's darkest secrets to the world, secrets that should have stayed buried. She was willing to tarnish the Marston name forever just to make a point. I couldn't let her do it. "So you poisoned her," Tony said, his words like a blade. "You used the champagne glass knowing it would be the perfect cover in a room full of people." Blackthorn's lips curled into a bitter smile. "It wasn't difficult. A drop of poison in the right glass, timed perfectly to strike at the moment of her triumph. Ironic, isn't it? She died thinking she'd won." Julian, his face pale with shock, stepped toward Blackthorn. "You killed her over a legacy that doesn't even matter anymore? The Marston name, it's meaningless without her." Blackthorn sneered. "Spoken like a spoiled child who's never known true loss. You've squandered everything you've been given. I only took what was owed to me." Hargrave motioned to the constables, who stepped forward. "Lord Blackthorn, you are under arrest for the murder of Lady Clarissa Marston." As the constables moved to restrain him, Blackthorn didn't resist. Instead, he fixed Tony and Sally with a look of dark amusement. "You think you've won, don't you? But you've merely scratched the surface. The Marston legacy is built on lies, and it will destroy you all." His words hung in the air as he was led away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The room fell silent in the wake of Blackthorn's departure. Julian sank into a chair, his head in his hands, while Vivian stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, the weight of the night settling over them. "It's over," Sally said quietly, though her tone lacked conviction. "Is it?" Tony replied. "Blackthorn's right about one thing. The Marston legacy is far from clean. And now that it's exposed, who knows what else might surface." Inspector Hargrave approached them, his stern expression softening slightly. "You did well, both of you." Sally gave a small smile. "Thank you, Inspector, but we couldn't have done it without your support." Epilogue: The Relic's Curse. A week later, Tony and Sally sat in their favorite corner of the Bramley College library, reflecting on the events at the Marston Manor. The reliquary had been turned over to the authorities, its contents catalogued and preserved. The Marston estate was in chaos, with Julian struggling to rebuild his family's reputation. "I can't stop thinking about what Blackthorn said," Sally admitted, closing the book she'd been pretending to read. "Do you think he was right? That the Marston legacy is cursed?" Tony leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful smile on his face. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just a reminder that even the grandest families have skeletons in their closets." Sally nodded. "I suppose some mysteries are better left buried." Tony's smile widened. "Not for us, though. Buried mysteries are our specialty." With that, the two friends returned to their studies, the thrill of their latest adventure fading into the promise of more to come.